Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 60 of the Principles of War podcast. This is a part 2 of Lord Horatio Nelson and the raid on Tenerife.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gents, as promised last week, we're continuing on with the attack. Let's get straight into it with the boats hitting the beach. How did the attack actually go? Not well. So the first attack, which was to go in on the 21st of July, suffered from the vagaries of the weather. A gale and a strong current meant that Trowbridge was still more than a mile offshore when dawn broke. The troops returned without doing anything. Trowbridge, uncertain of what to do, had returned to consult with Nelson. Rather than push on, rather than seize the initiative, the men were taken back to the ships. The next day, Betsy Fremantle wrote, "We anchored in a small bay at a short distance from the town but out of gunshot. The troops landed again this morning and had the most tiring and fatiguing day. For no good whatsoever, they went at the top of a high hill. The enemy on another of them stayed until evening. Almost dead with fatigue, hunger and thirst, they were obliged to return on board." So no contact. Surprise completely gone. Another council of war was held between Nelson and his captains. There was another 24-hour delay because of bad weather. And Nelson decided that he would try the direct approach. He would attack the town of Tenerife. And he would lead the assault himself. Betsy Fremantle, in her diary, wrote, "They are all to land in the town. As the taking of this place seemed an easy and almost sure thing, I went to bed after they were gone, apprehending no danger for Fremantle." Now, she may have been hearing the brave words of her husband to allay her fears. Nelson wasn't quite of the same frame of mind. He wrote to St. Vincent that by the next day, his head would probably be crowned either with a laurel or cypress, i.e. he was going to be a victor or dead. He tended to think like that. He was quite binary in how he thought his missions were going to go. 900 sailors and marines are to be put to shore. Nelson is going to lead the charge himself. Not only that, he is taking 5 captains with him. We certainly aren't going to be short of rank in this raid. Rank for rank, that is if a battle group is being led into action by a major general and 5 full colonels. It's quite a rank-heavy assault. Nelson knew that this was going to be a really tough fight. So tough, in fact, that he burnt the letters that he'd received from his wife in case he should not return. Andrew Lambert, in his excellent book, Britannia's God of War, describes what happened next. In attempting an assault on well-prepared shore defences from the sea, at night and with only small arms, the British were relying on surprise to unsettle the defenders. If the Spaniards stood to their guns and defended their positions until daybreak, the attack must fail. Around midnight, the boats went in, planning to land on the mole and storm the central castle. Inevitably, strong currents dispersed the boats, and the men came ashore in a variety of locations. Once roused, the Spaniards produced a terrific volume of fire that stalled the attack in all areas. The operation had failed. The day after the battle, Trowbridge wrote a letter to Nelson highlighting what had happened in the night's activity from his point of view. "From the darkness of the night, I did not immediately hit the mole the spot appointed to land at, but pushed on shore under the enemy's battery, close to the southward of the citadel. Captain Waller landed at the same time, and 2 or 3 other boats. The surf was so high, many put back, the boats were full of water in an instant and stove against the rocks, and most of the ammunition in the men's pouches was wet. As soon as I had collected a few men, I immediately advanced with Captain Waller to the square, the place of rendezvous, in hopes of their meeting you and the remainder of the people. And I awaited about an hour, during which time I sent a sergeant with 2 gentlemen of the town to summon the citadel. I fear the sergeant was shot on his way, as I heard nothing of him afterwards. The ladders being all lost in the surf, or not to be found, no immediate attempt could be made on the citadel. I therefore marched to join Captain Hood and Miller, who I had intelligence had made good their landing with a body of men to the southwest of the place I did. I then endeavoured to procure some account of you and the rest of the officers, but without success. By daybreak, we had collected about 80 marines, 80 pikemen, and 180 small-armed seamen. These I found were all who remained alive that had made good their landing. With this force, having procured some ammunition from the Spanish prisoners we had made, we were marching to try what could be done with the citadel without ladders when we found the whole of the streets commanded by field pieces and upwards of 8,000 Spaniards and 100 French under arms approaching by every avenue. As the boats were all stove and I saw no possibility of getting more men on shore, the ammunition wet and no provisions, I sent Captain Hood with a flag of truce to the governor to declare I was prepared to burn the town, which I should immediately put in force if he approached 1 inch further, and at the same time I desired Captain Hood to say it would be done with regret, as I had no wish to injure the inhabitants, that if we could come to my terms I was willing to treat, which he agreed to. I have the honour to send you a copy of them by Captain Waller, which I hope will meet with your approbation and appear highly honourable. The following parley was sent with the flag of truce. Santa Cruz, July 25th. That the troops and those belongings to His Britannic Majesty shall embark with all their arms of every kind, and take their boats off, if saved, and be provided with such other as may be wanting, in consideration of which it is engaged on their part that they shall not molest the town in any manner by the ships of the British squadron now before it, nor any of the islands in the Canaries, and prisoners shall be given up on both sides. Given under my hand and word of honour, Sam Hood, ratified by T. Trowbridge and J. Antonio Guterres. His letter finishes up, from the small body of men, and the greater part being pike and small-armed seamen, which can only be called irregulars, with very little ammunition in the pouches, but what had got wet in the surf at landing, I could not expect to succeed in any attempt upon the enemy whose superior strength I have before mentioned. The Spanish officers assure me they expected us and were perfectly prepared with all the batteries and the number of men already mentioned under arms. This, with the great disadvantage of the rocky coast, high surf, and in the face of 40 pieces of cannon, will show, though we were not successful, what an Englishman is equal to, and I have the pleasure to acquaint you that we marched through the town on our return with the British colours flying at our head. P.S. I beg also to say that when the terms were signed and ratified, the Governor, in the handsomest manner, sent a large proportion of wine, bread, and so forth to refresh the people, and showed every mark of attention in his power. There are two sides to the story about how the truce was negotiated. The Governor took care of the wounded. He provided boats for the remnants of the attack to get back to their ships. He even sent wine and bread and offered refreshments to the ships as they lay in the bay. His generosity was remarked upon by Nelson, who sent him a letter to thank him. So where was Nelson? Where was he in all of this action? Because he was meant to be leading the raid. He never made it ashore. As he was just about to step foot out of the boat, he had his right arm up, brandishing his sword, when he was struck just above the elbow, either by grape shot or by a musket ball. Either way, it was a significant injury. He had a lacerated artery. He was bleeding profusely. Fortunately for him, his stepson, Josiah Nesbitt, had the presence of mind to apply a tourniquet and to staunch the bleeding. It was an act that Nelson recognised saved his life. Josiah had the barge that Nelson was on turned around to get him back to the fleet and medical attention that he required. On the way back, they came across survivors of the sinking of the Fox, which had been holed below the waterline and sunk suddenly, with over 100 men on board. Nelson insisted that they stop to pick up some of the survivors. He also refused to be taken on board the Seahorse, which is where the barge was from, because Mrs. Fremantle was there and he didn't have word if Fremantle was alive or not. So he didn't want to be confronted with her and for her to see him in the state that he was in. So he was sent to the Theseus. Once he got there, he told the surgeon to prepare his instruments. He knew that the arm would have to come off. One of the midshipmen remarked, "He underwent the operation with the same firmness and courage that have always marked his character." But in letters, he did recall the terrible sensation of cold steel cutting into live flesh. Within an hour, he was back at work, penning a letter to the governor demanding the surrender of the Manila galleon. This letter was never sent. He maintained his professional demeanour until all of the survivors of the raid were back on board. After that, the pain, the psychological impact, and concerns about his career all started to take their toll. Within 48 hours, he was using his left hand to write to Sir John Jarvis. "My dear sir, I am become a burden to my friends and useless to my country. But my letter wrote the 24th, you will perceive my anxiety for the promotion of my son-in-law, Josiah Nesbitt. When I leave your command, I become dead to the world. I go hence, and I am no more seen. If from poor Bowen's loss you think it proper to oblige me, I rest confident you will do it. The boy is under obligation to me, but he paid me by bringing from the mole of Santa Cruz. I hope you'll be able to give me a frigate to convey the remains of my carcass to England. God bless you, my dear sir, and believe me, your most obliged and faithful Horatio Nelson. You will excuse my scrawl, considering it is my first attempt." He had significant pain with the arm and needed to take opium every night to alleviate the pain and to be able to sleep. And on August the 16th, he wrote to Admiral Jarvis, "A left-handed admiral will never again be considered as useful. Therefore, the sooner I get to a very humble cottage, the better, and make room for a better man to serve the state." But it was not to be. St. Vincent was already corresponding with Lord Spencer, the First Lord of the Admiralty, about how spry Nelson was and how there were good chances that he would return to full service to King and Country. And it was a good thing for Nelson, for the Royal Navy, and for the country that this was not viewed as a career-limiting move. It was a significant mistake on the behalf of Nelson, though. One of the mistakes with Tenerife was that Trowbridge did not aggressively move forward when he had the opportunity. Instead, he returned to consult with Nelson. It was a significant mistake. Surprise was lost, time was given to the defenders to prepare and to bring up reinforcements. Nelson was to write a couple of months later that, "Had I been with the first party, I have reason to believe complete success would have crowned our endeavours." This is in spite of the fact of him learning that there were 8,000 troops defending the town. So whether he could or could not have, it was one of the issues that he saw in the execution of the operation. However, he then goes on to say, "My pride suffered, and although I felt the second attack a forlorn hope, yet the honour of our country called for the attack and that I should command it. I never expected to return, and am thankful." In the Nelson Touch, Terry Coleman points out that on the second attack at Tenerife, 148 officers and men did not return from Santa Cruz. That is twice as many as were killed in the Battle of St. Vincent. The interesting thing about this, though, and this is part of the Nelson Touch, part of the mission command philosophy that he used, is that even though there had been 4 command conferences before the assault on Tenerife, Nelson accepted the full blame for the failure of the mission. Remember, that trust is between superiors and subordinates, and it goes up the entire chain of command because Jarvis claimed full responsibility for the failure of the assault on Tenerife when he reported back to the Admiralty. It was not a great operation, but the reward was worth what was wagered in the risk. And when the risk didn't come off, there was no retribution. And this is how actions are conducted in an organisation that fully embraces mission command. Jarvis wrote to Nelson, "Mortals cannot command success. You and your companions have certainly deserved it by the greatest degree of heroism and perseverance that ever was exhibited." This acceptance of risk and the behaviour when there is mission failure are absolutely critical. What other lessons are there for at the raid at Tenerife? Well, looking at some current doctrine, the planning considerations for a raid include surprise, security, the withdrawal, the choice of landing area, timing, purpose, embarkation, offensive support, landing, and rehearsals. Amphibious raids are planned and conducted in essentially the same manner as amphibious assaults, except that raids always include a pre-planned withdrawal of the raiding force. This is from the Australian Joint Doctrine, ADDP 3.2. Surprise. Surprise is an essential ingredient in the success of an amphibious raid and offsets the lack of logistic and fire support normally associated with amphibious operations. While operational surprise, presence of a force, is unlikely to be achieved, tactical surprise in timing and exact location of the raid is a key quality. For Nelson, he was able to achieve operational surprise. And he had tactical surprise in his first landing. The problem is, though, that once that surprise is gone, it's gone. And that gave time for the defenders of Tenerife to improve their defensive positions, to conduct rehearsals, and to prepare their militia. When the troops landed in the second raid at the mole, it was heavily defended. There were cannon pointing down the mole, and this is why the casualties were so high. Had the mole been assaulted at the first raid rather than further up the beach, the story may have been significantly different. Either way, though, it highlights the importance of that first raid and making sure that it is a main effort and is pursued aggressively. Security. Security during the planning and execution of a raid must receive particular attention to include full exploitation of deception measures. Now, the only deception measure that we really know of is the fact that some of the sailors were to be dressed up as Marines. One of the interesting components about security and the deception with this, though, is the story that there were 8,000 troops defending Tenerife, because that actually wasn't the case. That was what Governor Guterres wanted the British to believe, and I think that's partially because of the fact that he honourably gave them the ability to withdraw because of the fact that he well and truly knew about Nelson and his capabilities and respected his reputation. And having Nelson think that there were 8,000 troops defending Tenerife made it more likely that they wouldn't come back. The withdrawal must be planned in detail, including time and place for re-embarkation to amphibious ships. There must be provision for an alternative extraction method in the event of inclement weather, and emergency extraction if necessary. This is a component of the plan that wasn't really well thought out. However, in Nelson's defence, the doctrine that we are reading from is about 223 years further advanced than the doctrine that he was working off, if there was any doctrine. And I think really he was just working off the stories that he'd heard of what Blake had done and was trying to replicate that. The plan for the withdrawal did not go well. The armed cutter Fox was holed and sank. Many of the boats that went ashore were swamped or were smashed against the cliffs. The surf was quite treacherous, and that was going to make it increasingly difficult for them to get the men off the beach. Plan A fell apart, they had to go with Plan B, and hats off to Trowbridge, he was able to negotiate Plan B, and that was with Governor Guterres, and get him to ferry the British troops back to their ships. Which, when you think about it, is actually pretty good going, I think. It could have ended significantly worse for the British. The following factors influence the choice of landing areas. 1. Beaches or landing zones not necessarily meet all the requirements of an amphibious assault. In small-scale raids, beaches or landing zones are chosen from the point of view of ensuring tactical surprise. And 2, the limited objective and short duration of the amphibious raid usually simplifies logistic support requirements. The log requirements in this raid were significantly simpler than a contemporary raid. There was no capability for medevac. The ammunition for the operation was literally all of the ammunition that the sailors and marines carried on their person, and there was no requirement for fuel. The first attempt at the raid selected a beach that was further from the town, but enabled them to retain tactical surprise, seize decisive terrain that would enable them to outflank the town and force its surrender. That was the plan anyway. There were troubles on the beach with the surf. There were troubles with which piece of decisive terrain it was that they were meant to take. They actually climbed a hill. It was the incorrect hill and retired back to the ships, thoroughly disheartened, worn out, and very short of water because their logistics tail very light on. That put them in the position where they were required to conduct the second raid, which was much more difficult. The choice of landing area is a critical part of the planning process because it embodies the flexibility that is inherent to amphibious operations. Anywhere in the coastline potentially could be used for a landing. And that means that a defender needs to require a presence to provide early warning and a wide range of defensive plans based on the fact that he doesn't know where the enemy is going to land. The enemy may pick a landing site because it is suitable for amphibious operations, or it may choose something that is less suitable and therefore less likely and therefore potentially less well defended. One component of the planning process that was neglected by Nelson but has since become a much more important part of the amphibious planning process is reconnaissance. Very difficult for Nelson to do. He had limited time. He had poor maps. He didn't have any UAS or air support that he could put over the beach to see what was there, and in fact up in the hills to allow his planning to identify the decisive terrain and then inform all of his subordinates. But he did do the best that he could with the maps that he had. Timing, the duration of operations ashore may influence the choice of H-hour and consequently the conditions of visibility under which the raiding force is landed. This may also affect the scope of logistics and or combat service support arrangements. So, combat service support arrangements, there weren't any. Logistics, none. But the timing is interesting. And once again, a consideration that isn't a consideration today, but was a fundamental issue for Nelson was the fact that the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. And that was why Trowbridge took so long to land his troops in the first raid, because the current and the wind were against him. And that meant that they were landing in broad daylight. The purpose of a raid, including its relation to other concurrent or imminent operations that it may support, influences the selection of D-Day for the raid. In addition, these same factors may affect the availability of shipping, aircraft, logistics, and offensive support means for the raid. This was actually quite simplified for Nelson because he had a task force or a squadron of his own. He commanded all of the troops. And there were no other operations that he needed to synchronise. The timing of the raid was entirely up to him. The planning for the embarkation of assigned forces is similar to preparation for the amphibious assault, including considerations of operations security measures. So, Nelson pretty much had command of the seas, and the embarkation was actually handled quite well. There were fairly detailed orders that had come out, and it appeared that everyone knew what it was that they meant to do. It was only as the boats were approaching the shore that things began to come unstuck. So for embarkation, Nelson's done a really good job there. Offensive support planning is similar to that for an amphibious assault, except that where surprise is a major factor, fire support is usually withheld and radio silence is maintained until surprise is compromised. Well, Nelson maintained radio silence throughout the entire operation. That was well done. We're not really too sure of what the concept of offensive support was for the raid. We know that he did have a mortar boat, the Ray, under Lieutenant Compton. However, there were no OS assets to be landed with the raid, and I think that this is probably a reflection of how quick the raid was meant to be. Nelson probably could have landed a couple of the naval guns that he had. He had plenty of them. Probably could have been landed in the barges. Would have made the logistics effort significantly more complicated. However, wouldn't have been impossible, I would have thought. In the landing, the planning for STOM, or Ship to Objective Maneuver, is generally similar to that for an amphibious assault, except that movement may be made entirely by helicopter. Nelson did not use any helicopters in the raid. If he had, I dare say that he would have had a significant element of surprise on his side. Now, the last consideration for the planning of an amphibious raid is rehearsals. And given the complexity, even the complexity of an amphibious raid conducted in 1797, there are still lots of moving pieces that need to be synchronised. Given all that, there does not appear to have been any rehearsals for this. Integrated rehearsals are essential to precision and speed in executing a raid. All participating forces must rehearse every detail of disembarkation, movement ashore, operations ashore, withdrawal, and re-embarkation. Rehearsals as important in preparation for amphibious raids as they are for other types of amphibious operations. Timing is critical and cannot be accurately estimated or adhered to without adequate rehearsals. Nelson didn't conduct any rehearsals, but I think the thing that enabled him to synchronize the plan so well was the fact that he conducted command conferences where he got his captains together, they discussed what it was that needed to be done, why it was going to be done, and then they fleshed out the details of how it was going to be done. This enabled not only the capturing of the collective wisdom of the captains within the fleet, but it also ensured that they were all fully aware of how the plan was going to unfold. This was something that he had picked up when he had served under Samuel Hood. Not only did that time spent with the captains of the fleet enable the understanding of the mission, it enabled the formation of the trust between them, and it also meant that they understood what he was expecting of them, and this enabled them to act in situations where there wasn't time to be able to seek further guidance, or the inability to do that. For instance, when they were in contact, there was lots of smoke and it was difficult to make out signals. Compare and contrast with the leadership style of someone like David Beatty. He eventually became the first Sea Lord, but during the Battle of Jutland, he was a Rear Admiral in command of the battle cruiser fleet. He was not one for having dinner with his captains, and some of them were confused by his conduct and what was expected from them during the Battle of Jutland, and this had dire consequences for the Royal Navy during the battle. So, they are the planning considerations for a raid. We've had a look at them in relation to the raid on Tenerife, which, had it been successful, and it was highly unlikely that it would be successful because the ship that it required to be successful wasn't even there. We've spent a bit of time looking at Tenerife. We've looked at some of the peripheral issues. Someone as great as Lord Horatio Nelson, in his illustrious career, a career that has never been surpassed, he had significant setbacks. He made large mistakes, and Tenerife is definitely one of those mistakes. But there was a permissive environment that allowed naval officers to make mistakes, to learn from those mistakes, and to continue on in their career. When Trowbridge made a mistake by not pursuing his assault when he should have, Nelson took full responsibility for the failure of the raid, as did Jarvis when he publicly reported on what occurred at Tenerife. This permissive environment encourages officers to take prudent risks, knowing that they have the trust and support of their superiors. That is a fundamental part of Mission Command.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos, and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.